It's Vegas Grand Prix weekend and I really could not care about it. It's a race crammed into the schedule to just try and get, well, we've been over this before, but Max has been quite critical of the weekend and it seems to have got the organisers' panties in a twist, but the thing is, anybody could have told the organisers what Max said. And the meme that is the weekend on the strip has already got people laughing and at the same time rolling their eyes, which would look a little bit weird. Carlos Sainz's Ferrari has suffered irreparable damage after clattering a manhole cover. If I was in Carlos's spot, I'd be triple checking I still had an arsehole and or testicles, given how low these drivers sit to the ground. Shades of the Rally Turkey in 2004 when Marcos Gronholm's co-driver received a rock, and I quote, up in the ass. It's a piece of rally folklore at this point, a bit like Kimi needing his gloves and steering wheel in Formula 1, although not as much of a forced meme. But this Vegas stuff got me thinking about another piece of racing folklore that everybody who knows a bit about a particular category would be very familiar with, because it resulted in an outpouring of sympathy and probably one of the first ever pieces of crowdfunding in motorsport. So for today's video, I'm going to be looking at the time Dick Johnson hit the rock. That's an actual rock and not Dwayne. For this, we need to go all the way back to 1980 and down to Australia, because this race takes place at the Mount Panorama circuit in New South Wales, more specifically at the Bathurst 1000 of that year, the annual GM versus Ford fan fight that's disguised as a motor race. The 21st running of the Great Race was open to any car eligible under the Group C regulations of touring cars, as developed by the Confederation of Australian Motorsport, that, if I need to say that again, I'll just call CAMS. This, it should be noted, is not the same as Group C Endurance, the Mulsanne monsters that destroy the eardrums of anybody within 10,000 miles of Le Mans. This is Group C Touring Cars, which was started by CAMS in 1965, which was basically your standard issue Aussie muscle cars. These Group C cars replaced the Appendix J cars. Appendix J is something often mentioned in videos where I talk about regulation changes, as Appendix J in the FIA's International Sporting Code contains all the classifications, definitions and specifications of any new category of car. Now, if you have a spare few hours to burn, you can read every single one of the Appendix J handbooks on the FIA's website. As an example, here is Article 262 of the Appendix J handbook from 1993. On page 277, it outlines the specification for Class 2 touring cars, or as we know it, Super Touring. Now, this had started in Britain in 1990 as the 2-litre touring car formula, but it wasn't until 1993 it became officially recognised and defined by the FIA, before officially being called Super Touring in 1995, and this category replaced the outgoing Group A cars. Appendix J touring cars in Australia were in use from 1960 until 1964, and were cars limited to 100 examples built, 4 seats, and everything left stock, except for engines, valves, pistons, springs, and shocks. I'm also hoping brakes are on that exemption list too, but Appendix J became Group C improved production in 1965, and then in 1972 became just Group C touring cars. The reason for bringing in Group C was because Australia was having the supercar scare, which was a media frenzy started because of the homologation specials that Holden, Ford and Chrysler were building specifically for Bathurst. The scare was triggered when Ford was selling a 380 horsepower Falcon GTHO. A reporter at a newspaper had told a very safety-conscious minister about these 150-mile-an-hour cars, and soon everybody knew about them. 160-mile-an-hour supercars soon was the headline, and Milton Morris, who was the Transport Secretary in New South Wales at the time, tried to push through legislation to get new registrations of these cars banned, and his counterpart in Queensland tried to do the same. Now, Holden, who supplied a lot of government vehicles at the time, decided, okay, we need to keep things nice and cushy with the government here, so we won't build this V8 Tirana that we've got going. Ford, on the other hand, was pretty hacked off about all of this. They were convinced that the new Phase 4 GTHO was the safest yet. It had better handling, better brakes, and had a focus on drivability than outright power. Chrysler went ahead with the E55 and watered it down by advertising it as a lower model, and Ford did the same, while Holden put V6s in what would have been the V8 Tirana and sold those instead. At least that's how I understand it. But the whole thing was a non-story. The cars would have sold so few and only been able to have been bought by a few. It's not like there were going to be thousands of these things on the Australian roads. The later Group C regulations were designed to move away from production-based touring cars, so it meant that there would be fewer homologation specials making their way onto the road that could potentially kill people, and that was just to keep the busybodies and the government quiet. So when things rolled around in 1973, the cars were totally different to how they'd been in, say, 1967 or so. And this is also the same year that the Bathurst 500 miles became the Bathurst 1000 kilometres. So for the 1980 race, they split the field up into separate classes, all based off their engine capacities. 1600cc and below, 1601 to 2000cc, 2001 to 3000cc, and 3001 up to 6000cc. The top class was filled with just pure muscle. 8 Ford XD Falcons, 3 Chevrolet Z28 Camaros, 4 Holden VB Commodores, 9 VC Commodores, and a single Jaguar XJS. All these cars had V8s, except the Jag, which was a V12. In one of those XD Falcons was a man from Brisbane called Dick Johnson. Johnson had been racing since the mid-1960s in Holdens before moving towards Fords. Johnson's first race at Bathurst had been in 1973 in an LJ Tirana, where he finished 5th, and he didn't switch to Ford until 1977. Also on the grid was a man who had, unbeknownst to him at the time, been on the same military base as Johnson in the mid-1960s when they did their national service. That man was Peter Brock, who would win the Great Race 9 times in his career, and at the point this story takes place, he'd already won it 4 times, and the two men could not have been in differently funded cars. Brock was driving for the Holden dealer team, a team officially owned by the Holden dealer network, because GM had a policy in place that didn't allow any subsidiary company to fund its own racing projects. But Holden was sinking money into the effort thanks to then managing director John Bagshaw, who managed to run the entire thing without Detroit ever knowing about it. Johnson, meanwhile, was very much a privateer. He'd founded his own team at the start of 1980 and the team was run out of his home in South Brisbane. Johnson partly funded the team through a Shell petrol station he owned, and even though he would occasionally carry competitor branding, he still owned and operated the garage. While Brock had Marlboro backing and an entire car company behind him, Johnson had a car financed by his own business and also from Palmer Tube Mills, a Brisbane-based steel company. This was the true blue car that is the car most associated with Dick Johnson's early years in the ATCC, and this was his first time at Bathurst with his own team. He'd be full-time in the ATCC in 1981, and Peter Brock actually welcomed this XD Falcon onto the grid, and Johnson in particular, because he knew Johnson was a good driver, and this Falcon was actually pretty good, so it meant that Holden would actually have some competition. It was actually a surprise to many that Johnson's Ford ended up on the front row for the Great Race, in front of Brock, who had taken pole at all 12 races so far that season. Johnson and Kevin Bartlett had actually set the same time in qualifying, but Bartlett would be on pole because he set his time first. So the top 10 was Bartlett Forbes, Johnson French, Brock Richards, Harvey Harrop, Grice Smith, O'Brien Morris, Charlie O'Brien and Wigston, Jansen and Perkins, Moffat and Fitzpatrick, and Rogers and Geisler. At the start, Johnson managed to get into the lead, and Brock ended up a lap down when he hit a backmarker Holden, which made up the tail end of one of the smallest fields of a multi-class 1000, although the crowds had interest due to Johnson appearing out of seemingly nowhere and being in race-winning contention. It meant that Ford had somebody, well, literally in the race. But on lap 17, Johnson was out. Johnson had come through the cutting, turn 3 or turn 4 depending on how you read the map, and was heading up the hill towards the summit of the track at McPhillamy Park, and a young woman called Jill Middleton saw this Falcon absolutely clang the outside concrete wall as it exited the next right-hander. As circumstances would have it, on that day my leg was in plaster as the result of a ski accident in Thredbo a few weeks earlier. 3 of us were sitting in our usual spot near the cutting, and it was never crowded as other places around the track were. I decided it was time for a few closer pictures, normally of Dick as he came round. So with my trusty knocker mat around my neck, I carefully made my way down to the fence, leant my crutches against it, and watched as Dick's car went down Conrod. Then I readied myself. I glimpsed the car through the bushes at the cutting, so I was ready when he emerged. Jill managed to snap one of the most iconic Bathurst 1000 images ever. I wish I could show you it, but it is as I described. The Falcon utterly smacked the concrete wall and ripped the wheel off, with the car getting up at almost a 45-degree angle and a marshal running for his life. Jill's friends didn't even believe she'd caught the shot. They are the only pictures of the accident as it happened. I'm sure she's made a tidy sum off that image in the last 43 years. Later on, Johnson was down in the pits being interviewed on Channel 7, the broadcaster for the race, looking shaken, upset and angry all at the same time. Just couldn't believe my bloody eyes. Those galoots up there that just throw boulders. Like it was enormous. Johnson's crash had been caused by him hitting a rock that had rolled onto the track somewhere close to where Jill Middleton had been with her friends. This rock was around the size of a football, around 22 centimetres in diameter. Johnson was under the impression that it was two drunk yobbos that had intentionally rolled this thing onto the track, but then there's an eyewitness report that says it was two people who were lying on a bank and accidentally kicked it down. The cost of the damage to the car was so high that Johnson explained that if he couldn't raise the 40 grand needed to fix it, he'd have to give up racing, because the car would have been a total write-off and there wouldn't be any money to do the necessary repairs. The commentators on the broadcast later informed Johnson that the switchboard at the offices in Sydney had started lighting up, and people were actually overloading the phone lines because they were calling up and asking if there was any way of donating to help Johnson get the money to fix the car. Such was the way the retirement had been caused. By the end of the race, the fans, both blue and red, had raised over $40,000 for him. Australian dollars, that is. Ford Australia, seeing what had happened and now seeing the publicity from their new hero amongst the fans, matched the donation and gave Johnson a new shell. Actually, speaking of donating and crowdfunding, on Sunday I'll be racing in the Drive for Wishes 8 hours at Le Mans in iRacing, in aid of the Make-A-Wish Foundation. I'll be driving solo for the whole 8 hours in the Cadillac GTP for Rocket SimSport, raising money for a fantastic cause as Make-A-Wish now branches out into helping grant motorsport-related wishes for terminally ill children all over the world. So if you want to watch me go through the ringer for your entertainment and for charity, that race will be going live around 2:15 PM on Sunday afternoon UK time. Donation link will be in the description if you want to help get the ball rolling on that. Determined to repay everybody for their generosity, Johnson entered the ATCC full-time in 1981 and finished every single race on the podium as he went on to win the championship. And then at Bathurst in 1981, he'd win, but it wasn't without its problems. In the early 1980s, McPhillamy Park wasn't as it appears on your screen now. That gravel trap didn't exist, and on lap 121, Bob Morris and Christine Gibson collided, with Gary Rogers and Tony Edmondson joining the party not long after. Two more cars, those being David Selden and Kevin Bartlett, also joined in, and as there was no gravel trap, the track was blocked, and they had to stop the race. It wasn't restarted, and Johnson was declared the winner. Johnson would win Bathurst 3 times and would be ATCC champion 5 times. Dick Johnson Racing is still active to this day, with Shell backing, and had recent success when the team was co-owned by American racing legend Roger Penske. 3 titles with Scott McLaughlin before he went over to IndyCar, and the team continues to run the Blue Oval. But it's mad to think that a crash caused by an inanimate object being sent out onto a racetrack could make someone's career. It is something that could only happen at Bathurst or at a rally event, but then in 2023 the same thing goes and happens to a state-of-the-art Formula 1 car at a brand new track at the height of the publicity for Formula 1 because of the way the whole thing's been presented, and there's no apology, there's no compensation, there's no acknowledgement, there's no we'll let you use an engine and gearbox outside of the pool so you don't get a penalty because it's something that's totally beyond your control. It's one of the times that the sport has regressed rather than progressed. So then, a look at the time Dick Johnson hit the rock. If this has taught you something new here today, then like the video so I know a good job was done, and for more dives through the motorsport history books, get subscribed and get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Big thanks to the people of Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help with the picture purchasing piggy bank, you can do so by following the link in the description, where there's also a link to Discord and my socials, as well as my affiliate links. Under the video is the button for memberships, and there's also super thanks if you want to do a one and done donation. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.